Oslo, Norway, February 14th, 1972. -9 degrees Celsius. 48,000 people packed into Bislett Stadium, sitting on plastic bags over snow that had not been cleared from the seats, breathing clouds of white vapor into air so cold it cut through skin and bone. They had come to see one man, Erik Halvorsen, 6'4", 265 pounds, 31 competitions, 31 first places, never defeated. The strongest man in all of Norway. And standing across from him in the ring, silent and still, a Chinese man weighing 143 pounds, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and simple gray training clothes. If you had passed him on the street that morning, you would not have turned your head. The crowd laughed. The journalists had already written the result in their notebooks. This was not a fight. This was a spectacle. The only question was how many seconds it would last. But that afternoon, under a gray Oslo sky and cold that sliced through faces, a moment arrived when 48,000 people went completely silent. Nobody in the stands could speak. Nobody could move. Because what was about to happen in that ring had never been seen before in any stadium in the world. Erik Halvorsen did not know what losing felt like. Born in a fishing village on Norway's southern coast where the air smelled like salt and wet wood, where the horizon stayed gray and life hardened you before you could choose whether you wanted to be hardened. At 7, he climbed coastal cliffs. At 12, he swam in open water with currents that would have terrified adults. At 16, he began competing in local strength contests and never stopped. By 29, his record was perfect. He had broken the national lifting record 3 times. All 3 times, he had broken his own record. At the 1971 Viking Strength Championship in Oslo, Erik carried a 200-kilogram stone on his shoulders for 47 seconds without setting it down. His rivals had surrendered before reaching halfway. Several of their knees touched the ground in front of the entire audience. Erik was not even sweating. And now, on a brutal February morning in 1972, he stood shirtless before the press inside the marble halls of the Viking Museum in Oslo. Behind him rose a 9th-century ship, dark wood carrying centuries of silence. A journalist approached with a photograph. In the photo appeared a thin Asian man with wire-rimmed glasses and ordinary clothes. The journalist raised the image. "Erik, what do you think of Bruce Lee?" The silence thickened. Erik looked at the photo for a long moment, then lifted his head with that expression of his, what an inexperienced eye would read as pure confidence, but what a more careful observer would recognize as the first crack of arrogance. "A small actor from a tropical climate," Erik said. "Someone who has never seen an Oslo winter. In this ring, with this cold, he would not last 10 seconds against me. My ancestors were Vikings. The cold is our weapon. Size is real. What this small man does in his movies is completely fake. I am inviting him. If he comes, the public will discover who he really is." That statement was published the next day on the front page of 8 Norwegian newspapers. 3 days later, Bruce Lee accepted. The press conference was held in a film studio office in Tokyo. Bruce had been awake since 5 in the morning and had already completed 2 hours of training. Journalists fired questions one after another. "How will you handle sub-zero temperatures? Erik doubles your weight. Is this an exhibition or a real fight?" Bruce looked at them one by one. His voice was calm, unhurried, carrying no extra weight. "The cold will be there. I will be there. That is enough. A reporter insisted, but, physically speaking, Bruce cut him off before he finished the sentence. Physically speaking, a falling stone can be deflected by the wind. What matters is not the size of the stone, but how it was thrown. Nobody in that room fully understood that phrase. They would understand soon. To comprehend what happened that day in Oslo, you need to know where each of these men came from. Eric's story began in 1943 in a small town near Bergen, a place that smelled like fish and cold dust, gray and heavy. Before his father disappeared at sea, he taught Eric exactly one thing. Son, there are two types of people in the world, those who see the wave coming and those who face it head-on. Eric decided from the first moment to be the second type. At 13, he started lifting weights. At 15, he filled empty sacks with sand and carried them on his shoulders 3 hours a day. At 18, he lifted things nobody else in that town could move. He never went to university. Never seemed necessary. Talent was not measured on paper. It was measured in granite. And in every measurement, Eric came first. When the challenge was announced, the Norwegian sports community laughed. Martial arts journalists were skeptical. One of Europe's most respected combat sports critics wrote that week, "This event is essentially a disrespectful spectacle. Putting a 143-pound man in front of Eric Halvorsen is no different than a circus act." But someone read that article and wrote something in a notebook. It turned out that note was written in Bruce Lee's personal notebook. It was a single line. Size can create the illusion of power, but the real test is something else. Bislett Stadium sat in the heart of Oslo, capacity 45,000. That day, Monday, February 14, 1972, the doors opened at 10 in the morning. By noon, the stadium was full. By 1 in the afternoon, the snow on the field had not even been cleared, and people sat on plastic bags. The cold was the type that passes through clothes, skin, and bones. Every breath came out converted to white vapor, floating between the stands like chalk dust. Hot beverage vendors were surrounded by crowds. 48,000 people. To put that in perspective, the combined attendance of all other sporting events held in Norway that day did not reach half that number. At 2:15, Eric Halvorsen emerged from the south tunnel, chest bare. The stands exploded. Eric walked to the ring, grabbed the corner post, and waited. They brought out a 200-kilogram Viking stone. Eric lifted it in a single movement, set it on his shoulder, and walked a complete lap around the ring for 45 seconds. Crystal glasses trembled in people's hands. The audience rose to its feet. Every murmur, every doubt, every thought that this is just a show dissolved into pure adrenaline. And then, silence. From the south tunnel, without fanfare, without raising a hand to the audience, wearing a simple gray shirt and walking one steady step after another, appeared Bruce Lee. 48,000 Norwegians froze in their seats. When Bruce grabbed the corner rope, the crowd's reaction could be summarized in one word: silence. But not the silence of respect. It was that type of silence produced when you feel something has gone wrong. A brief, strange stillness caused by the question, did the wrong person just come out? Murmurs began running through the stands. Journalists in the front rows looked at each other. One was scribbling something in his notebook, probably something like, unimpressive entrance. Eric Halvorsen stood in his corner directly across the ring. His eyes were fixed on Bruce, and in those eyes, if you looked carefully, there was only one thing: relief. He had been waiting. Perhaps he had expected a rival, a threat, at least someone who looked like a real challenge. But what he saw had left him completely calm. And that calm was the first step toward the biggest mistake Eric Halverson would make that day. Bruce passed between the ropes and walked to the center of the ring. His feet tested the surface with each step, probing. It was not frozen, but it was wet, cold, and slippery. The sun sat low on the horizon, and the shadow of the upper stands covered half the ring. Bruce stopped exactly in the center of that shadow and observed the stadium around him. 48,000 people. Not a single breath could be heard. Bruce was not warming up, not stretching, not moving his neck. He simply stood there with his arms at his sides. His eyes were not closed, but they were directed inward, as if he had set aside all the stadium noise and was measuring something only he could feel. A Norwegian photographer working at the ring's edge said afterward, "I looked up toward the stands, tens of thousands of people. Then I looked at Bruce, and in that moment I realized he was the only calm person in the entire stadium. Everyone else was nervous or excited. Only he had no nerves of any kind." The referee called both men to the center. Eric advanced. The floor seemed to creak beneath him, and that is not an exaggeration. His shoes had rubber soles, but each step with 265 pounds behind it was a statement in itself. While the referee reviewed the rules, Eric did not take his eyes off Bruce's for a single instant. That was his pre-fight ritual. The referee finished. The two men retreated to their corners. Eric wore nothing against the cold. That was a deliberate decision. For years he had trained outdoors in Bergen winters. The cold did not affect him. Or at least, that is what he believed. His chest was bare, and when the frozen air touched his skin, he did not flinch once. Bruce wore a gray long-sleeved shirt. His arms were covered, only his hands remained exposed. But, if you looked carefully, you would notice something. Bruce's breathing was different. When most people exhaled, a thick cloud of vapor came from their mouths. Bruce's breath was barely visible, slower, deeper, more controlled, as if his body was not releasing heat into the air, but retaining it inside. That was a technique. In Chinese tradition, it is called nei gong, control of internal energy, regulation of body temperature through breath management. Bruce had been working on this since his early years in Hong Kong, but he had never needed it as much as now. In the stands, people whispered, "How long will it last?" He falls at the first blow. Eric wins for sure, but in what second? And then the bell rang. Eric moved immediately. For a man his size, he was faster than you would expect. His first step came with complete weight transfer. By the second step, his right fist was already rising. It was a wide, horizontal blow thrown from the shoulder. If it connected with the jaw, there would be no debate about which direction Bruce would fly. But Bruce was not there. He had slid 8 centimeters to the left. Only 8. The fist passed, grazing his ear, so close the air current brushed his skin. Eric had already launched his second movement. Left arm, this time not a punch, but a push designed to send the opponent backward. Against an 80-kilogram man, it would have sent him flying 2 meters. Against most men, it would have ended everything right there. But Bruce was not there either. He had not only moved right, he had moved forward at the same time. A spectator described the moment this way. Eric was punching the wind, and the wind was turning around to look at him. Eric Halverson had never missed in his life. When those hands closed around something, they did not open. There was a legend at Eric's Bergen training camp. When he was young, his coach told him to grab a post and not let go. He held it for 6 hours. His hands bled. He did not let go. But now, in the frozen air of Bisley Stadium, Those hands were closing around nothing. The first two blows had missed. This was not in Eric's calculations. Smaller men normally retreated, went defensive, let themselves be cornered. This small man was moving forward, not just dodging, repositioning, and that repositioning was breaking every assumption Eric's momentum was built on. Eric stopped for a fraction of a second, and the stands noticed. 48,000 people inhaled at the same time. Then Eric moved again. Different this time. 2 slow steps, then an explosion. Left shoulder pushing in, right arm following behind. This was a wrestler's movement. Close distance. Grab. Take down. Immobilize. With weight. This tactic had always worked for Eric. He had taken down bigger men with it. Bruce felt the pressure from the left side and rotated his body at an almost invisible angle, just enough to redirect Eric's charge away from his center of gravity. When Eric's shoulder passed through empty space, Bruce's right hand touched Eric's wrist, barely, almost gently. Did not block it, did not break it, did not hold it. Just redirected it 5 centimeters. But those 5 centimeters had redirected all the kinetic force of 265 pounds in the wrong direction. When Eric realized he was about to go forward, he had already taken 1 step too many. Balance recovered, but rhythm broke. And Eric's entire fighting system was built on rhythm. When a strength athlete loses rhythm, he needs time to restart his next movement. Bruce did not give him that time. A blow to the right shoulder, short, with the elbow, almost casual, almost hidden inside the movement. It was not powerful, not devastating, but it was exactly placed. It landed on the deltoid of Eric's right shoulder, just above the scapula. For a strength athlete, that point is not just muscle. It is a critical gear in a very tight machine. It was not exactly pain. It was a signal. The body's way of saying, "Pay attention. This is here." Eric stopped. The stands did not catch the hesitation this time, but a photographer did. His camera froze that exact instant. That photo was published in several Norwegian sports newspapers the following days. The expression on Eric's face was hard to put into words. It was not surprise, not anger. It was the face of a man who had just realized his calculations did not add up. Something strange was beginning to become evident in the stands. In the first moments, every movement had come from Eric, but nobody could land a clean blow on Bruce. And yet Bruce was not the one attacking. In fact, he barely moved. The logic of the fight was reversed. The big man was the one moving, but every result went exactly where the small man seemed to want it to go. That did not fit how the audience expected a fight to work. Normally the big man attacks and the small man defends or flees. What was happening here was neither. The small man was not attacking, not fleeing. He was simply there, with almost disturbing precision, always in the right place. A journalist wrote in his notebook that day, "Bruce Lee is not dancing, but Eric seems to be following Lee's choreography." Eric breathed deeply. White vapor bloomed in the frozen stadium air and dispersed. Then something changed in his eyes. He was calculating, and the calculation was not giving him good news. When Eric was 15, he met an old fisherman on the Bergen docks. The man was well past 80. His hands were gnarled like tree roots, but his eyes remained clear. That day, as Eric walked swaggering through the port, the old man stopped him. "Son," he said, "there are 2 types of strength. The first is believing nothing can stop you. The second is knowing it can." Eric did not listen. He was young, strong, impatient. The old man's words seemed abstract and useless. But now, inside the frozen air of Bisley Stadium, that phrase had returned like a ghost. Because Eric was about to discover that he could be stopped. And it was not the fists of the man in front of him. It was the cold. Large muscles need powerful blood flow. That flow produces heat through effort. But if that heat is spent too quickly, or the cold air steals it, muscles begin to cool. And a cold muscle contracts slower, generates less force. Eric was right in the middle of that process. And then there was this. Eric had burned an enormous amount of energy. Each missed blow was not just a physical waste. Each of those movements meant his muscles had activated at maximum load and returned empty. He was burning fuel and losing body heat at the same time, cooling and exhausting himself simultaneously. Two processes accelerating each other. Bruce was experiencing exactly the opposite. That day, before entering the stadium, Bruce had spent 2 hours alone in a hotel room. To an outside observer, it would have seemed he was simply sitting. But he was not sitting. He was doing breath work. With each breath cycle, he was preparing his body, not just mentally, but physically. Researchers would demonstrate years later that certain breathing techniques can raise core body temperature by 1 to 2 degrees. Bruce had not learned this from a textbook. He had learned it from practice. And now, with temperatures well below zero, that practice was bearing fruit. In the ring, yes, Bruce's breath was visible, coming out as vapor in the cold air, same as everyone. But the rhythm had not changed. Eric's breathing, meanwhile, was becoming shallower. Even from the front rows of the stands, you could see the difference. Eric tried again. He started with his left arm this time, but did not continue with his right. It was a feint. Draw the small man to the wrong side, then catch him with the real blow. This had worked for Eric before. Rivals reacted to the first movement and left themselves completely exposed for what came next. Bruce did not react. Eric did not expect that, because there were only two reasons not to react to a feint. Either you had not seen it, or you had seen it and decided not to bite. The first was impossible. Bruce's eyes were fixed on him, so it had to be the second. Bruce had read it for what it was, a deception. That told Eric something. The man in front of him was not just reacting. He was reading him before the movement was complete. That was not a matter of simple reflexes. It was a skill built over decades of combat. The ability to read minimal variations in an opponent's muscle tension, the direction of weight transfer, the angle of a shoulder joint. Eric needed a second to absorb that reality. And in that second, Bruce advanced one single step, left and forward diagonally. That step opened Eric's right side, his dominant side, his most powerful side, but also the side that left him most exposed to losing balance when fully committed to a movement. Bruce's right hand came down on Eric's right shoulder again. Same point, same light touch, precise, almost courteous, but deeper this time. And Eric had to involuntarily step left to stay on his feet. Something happened in the stadium at that moment. A handful of people in the front row stood up. They could feel something had changed. They could not have said exactly what, but they knew the fight was not going as it was supposed to. The sound of the crowd had changed. At first it had been loud, festive, confident. An audience that knew Eric, wanted Eric, had already given Eric the victory before the bell rang. But now the sound was different, quieter. And floating in that silence was a different type of question. What is this small man doing? Eric focused. The great advantage of a strength athlete is the ability to end everything in one movement. One clean blow and all equations change. Eric knew this. He decided to load everything into a single blow. He was going to push with his right shoulder. Target: Bruce's chest. Goal: take him to the ground. Fall on top of him. Close the argument. He stepped forward, drew in a long, deep breath of air, and that breath was one of the most important of Eric Halverson's life, because that breath, though he did not know it consciously, was a declaration of commitment. When a man stakes everything on one movement with no turning back, the body gathers the reserves it has left. Bruce saw that breath. He processed everything simultaneously in an instant, in microseconds. The tension building in Eric's shoulders, the weight transferring forward, the angle of the right foot pressing against the ground, the breath. All together carrying one message: it is coming. And Bruce waited, like a matador. The word matador is not chosen randomly. During that time, while studying boxing, Bruce had researched the movement mechanics of Spanish bullfighters. The art of the matador consisted of using the bull's own strength. The bull was enormous, strong, lethal. The matador was small, fast, intelligent. And the matador's most important weapon was refusing to meet force with force, leaving the space the bull had filled with its power, redirecting that force slightly, and watching as the bull became victim of its own momentum. Eric Halverson was the bull in that moment. With 265 pounds of momentum, he launched forward. His hands were closing on Bruce's chest. Distance reduced to 0. The stands, which had been holding their breath this entire time, were about to release it. Every calculation, every prediction, every bet, everything was about to be confirmed in this single moment. And in that moment, Bruce Lee stepped to the left. Eric's hands closed around nothing. A 265-pound body had lost its target and now had nowhere to go except forward. The surface was wet and cold. Eric stumbled. Massive weight without destination. His left foot slipped. His right foot tried to hold him, but momentum was too great. His body tilted forward. Hands searched for balance that did not exist. Eric fell onto one knee. Then hands touched the ground. Then the other knee. Cold snow sank into his palms. His face was centimeters from the ring floor. His breath, fast and choppy, came out in small white bursts. 48,000 people could not emit a single sound for 1 full second. They were in shock, trying to process what they had just seen. And in that second, everything had changed. Eric Halverson had never been in that position in his life. Hands on the ground, knees in the snow, breath uncontrolled. Never, not once. This was not just a physical situation. It was the moment when 31 years of a story, 31 years of an identity, 31 years of beliefs began to rewrite themselves. From the day that boy in the Bergen port had ignored the old fisherman's words, Eric had never felt so exposed. And now, in front of 48,000 people, with cold cutting his skin and hands sunk in snow, that exposure had returned. The stands exploded, but not the type of explosion you might expect. It was not for Eric. It was not a roar of victory for Norway's strongest man. It was commotion. 10,000 people at once, confused, caught off guard, unable to make sense of what they had just seen, all emitting one sound at the same time. Less an applause and more a question. Some had stood up. Others grabbed the arm of whoever was beside them. Somewhere in the crowd, someone had spilled their hot tea. Bruce Lee simply stood there, exactly where he had been. He had stepped to the left, maintained balance, and dropped his arms to his sides. His breathing remained steady. His face showed no triumph, no anger, no pity. He was waiting, like a doctor evaluating a patient, like a teacher observing a student. Eric pressed his hands against the ground and tried to get up. He wanted to stand. His body was exhausted in a way he was only now fully feeling. The cold snow against his palms filtered inward. His muscles were dealing simultaneously with lactic acid, cold, and the physical impact of the fall. But Eric rose, slowly, with difficulty. But he rose. And the instant he did, Bruce took 3 steps forward. Not running, not hurrying. He stopped in front of Eric and extended his hand. Extending your hand in the middle of a fight means different things depending on context. In wrestling, sometimes it is a gesture, sometimes it is performance. But Bruce's hand carried none of that. It was offered with sincerity, in silence, with simplicity. One person to another. Eric looked at that hand, looked at it for a long moment. 48,000 people held their breath, because everyone understood that whether Eric took that hand or not would determine the real result of this fight. The physical result was already written, but the real result was being written right now. Eric took Bruce's hand, and Bruce lifted him from the ground. A 265-pound man stood up holding the hand of a 143-pound man. That image became the most reproduced photograph of that day. Years later, it was used as the cover of a chapter in a book about Norwegian sports history under the title Strength and Understanding. In the photo, you could see Eric's face, and in it was an expression the sports world rarely sees: pure respect, unfiltered, without armor. Eric stepped back, found his balance, and looked at Bruce. He held that gaze for a long moment. Then, with a voice loud and clear enough to rise above the noise of the entire stadium, and in English, not Norwegian, because he felt what he was about to say was not just for Norway, he spoke. "You have the spirit of Valhalla." In Viking mythology, Valhalla was the hall where warriors went after dying in battle. But in this context, it meant something different. The spirit of Valhalla was not invincibility. It was the will to fight, knowing you can lose. To keep moving forward, even when you know your limits. To stand in front of the hardest thing you have faced in your life, without fear of what comes next. Eric reached into his bag and pulled out something small. It was an ancient seal, a rounded piece of stone from the Viking era, carved with Nordic runic symbols. Eric had carried it with him for years. It came from his grandfather, who had received it from his own grandfather before him. In Viking tradition, it was the symbol a warrior gave to another warrior as a sign of respect. Eric placed it in Bruce's palm. Bruce looked at it, ran his finger over the carved symbols, raised his eyes to meet Eric's. He did not say, "Thank you," did not smile, just looked. And in that look, the 2 men understood something that existed without words, without translation, without borders. 48,000 Norwegians stood. The applause shook the stadium.